Well, we are just here at time, so we can go ahead and get started and kick off for today. Thanks everyone, whether you're connecting from morning, afternoon, evening. I know we're spread across all a range of time zones, so I appreciate you all being able to come out and join for today. I know that maybe there's been some webinar sessions where maybe you could have maybe done a little bit of teaching to some of the folks as well. So hopefully this webinar today will be a little more of a conversation, and you'll get to have a picture to the open source side that is maybe a part or something you've seen before, but is a deeper insight into what goes into an open source project and community. So I'll go ahead and kick us started here, make sure that screen sharing is working. You can just let me know if you can see my screen. Is my screen visible?
Yep, we can see your screen, Justin.
Perfect. Great. So if you want to follow along with this, make sure you have your microphones muted so we don't have background noise. Thanks. And if you want to follow along with this as we go, you can find these slides online at the link below. But today's conversation is an introduction to open source. So normally when we would do these webinars in New York City before the COVID pandemic times, I'd like to start, we can try out using the Zoom reactions here just to get an idea of how some folks feel at this. But if you can use the raise hand, or I guess thumbs up icon in Zoom, if you've ever contributed to an open source project as part of work or outside of your work, you can just use the thumbs up and use that reaction if you've contributed. So I see a couple here, but seems like otherwise it's kind of a new area, new thing for a lot of folks. I see a couple here. So next one is, how many of you have actively participated in an open source community prior to this current product or current team you're working with? Again, you can just use the thumbs up icon for that one. Seeing a little fewer numbers, but still some good range of folks who have participated, worked in open source too. So that's helpful to know as well. So today's webinar, we're going to be coming in a little bit at a high level approach, but also going into the picture of what goes into a open source project and really understanding what that means. So I like to start first from the basics when we're talking about these things. Open source, what is it? It's open source, it's a method. It's a method we use to develop and distribute software and hardware, as well as a set of best practices that help make software that we use to make software and build teams that make software. It's a movement. It's a movement.
Sorry to say, Justin, but you are on mute.
I'm sorry. I guess, did that switch off?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
2 seconds.
So not sure when that changed over, but I'll just pick up here. But open source, it's a method. It's a way that we work. It's a movement. It comes with a set of values and ideals that go beyond just code. And it's also a culture. It's a collection of people, values, and ideas that take the form of software and technology projects and communities. So what are we going to be looking at today? We're going to be going into three main areas, or looking at three main areas for today's Open Source 101. We'll start with an accelerated view at the last 40 years of free and open source history. Then we'll talk a little bit about building your open source house, and then finally wrap up with looking at sustainable business models for open source. So a little bit about who I am. My name is Justin. I work with the UNICEF Office of Innovation as their open source technical advisor, and I've been doing open source for about a third of my life. So I work with various open source projects around the web, ranging from operating systems to web development and front end and back end tech, as well as some of the innovation fund teams that we've worked with over the course of the last few years with the fund. Since June 2020, I joined full-time with the team, and some of the things that I work with in the Office of Innovation are things around technical assistance for open source and providing support and guidance on community and collaboration, looking at metrics and doing assessments on the open source work and understanding the sustainability of the technology we've invested in. So again, coming back to this question of what exactly is open source, but in a little more concrete, detailed overview. So the first thing you'll often see when we talk about open source is this 4-letter acronym, FOSS, free and open source software. So when we say this, free and open source, we mean not as like free as in pizza or free as in beer, but free as in speech. So the source code is publicly available for reading and reuse and modification. But FOSS is also more than just software. It's also a set of development practices and licenses and communities that exist to help build software together underneath a shared set of common values. So again, if we were in person, I'd like to do the raise hand, but I'll skip over that reaction piece for this one. But you might recognize maybe half of the logos, maybe all of the logos on this screen. So open source is everywhere in our world today, both from the public and private perspective. Just to name some here, the White House has built their, I know they use either it's WordPress or Drupal, an open source content management system for all of their content. Twitter is a huge consumer and user of open source. Wikipedia is all open source content, and even players like Google and Facebook and these other really big tech companies are building and using open source. But it also goes a little further too. Open source is a huge part of the internet and the web as we know it today. So this is showing just from 2014, a little bit dated here, but still pretty interesting to look back at the operating systems that were used and measured across public internet servers. So it found that about 79.3, 80% of all public internet servers were using a free and open source operating system called Linux. And Linux, in turn, was running open source software like the Apache HTTPD web server and these other tools that we use to serve and deliver web content in the browser. Some of these logos on the side, again, you might recognize. It goes also further just in the room where you are right now. Probably in your pocket, some of you have an Android phone or you're familiar with the Firefox browser. Maybe you've seen LibreOffice, which is the open source alternative to Microsoft Office. There's all these other places that open source exists in more visible ways in our world too. When we come and look at programming languages and the coding and the code that is used to build so many of the projects that we're working with, all of these are also open source languages. And you'll also notice a diversity of ownership here as well, with the Python software language being owned by the Python Software Foundation, the .NET framework, which was not always open source, but Microsoft then a few years ago ended up releasing it as open source or mostly as open source. And then also Apple has done the same with their Swift programming language. So it's really interesting to get that view that all these folks are using open source and public code, but like, why do we do that? Why is it a benefit? Why do folks put in that effort for that? I like to group it into these 4 categories or views of why we have public code, why we use open source. One piece of it is about control, that it's always possible to study and understand how something works, and nobody can tell you what and how to use the software. There's also a training benefit that you get to have some learning that happens in the public, and you benefit from a connection to a wider ecosystem beyond what can exist for just a single closed work. You also get faster feedback. For security, again, easier to audit, and it's often quicker to solve problems just due to a principle of the number of eyes that are open to the code. And finally, there's a stability angle that it's possible to build on open, common standards that are shared across technology projects. It improves interoperability, and it's easier to fork on and continue a work if it comes down to that. And there's going back to the security piece, there's a common phrase in the open source sustainability circles of Linus's law that given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. This is connected back to one of the oldest open source projects that I mentioned on a previous slide, the Linux kernel, which we'll talk a little bit in this presentation. So with that, before we can get into understanding how this impacts your work and what you're going to be doing over the next 12 months with open source, it does help to get a little bit of a picture into how we got to where we are today. So the beginning of the free software movement as we know it now effectively began in the 1980s. The major timeline here, or major first milestone, was Richard Stallman founding this project called the GNU Project. For some background and context, in the 60s and 70s, or more the 70s, when Stallman was working at the MIT Media Lab, he noticed this trend of how the industry around software was beginning to change. Because up until that time, really everyone had been so focused commercially on hardware. Hardware was the thing that people were putting all their money into and nobody wanted to share. So when it came to software before this time, people just shared it. People just openly copied it and shared it across different works because you had to do all this extra work if you actually wanted to make the software work on a different computer. It was all this extra labor and cost. So it wasn't always, people didn't think about software the way we look at it now. But Stallman lived in this period in MIT Media Lab. And then in the 80s, things started to shift. Suddenly software became this commodity and it became more valuable in the commercial market. People realized that it had this angle to it. So he noticed that all of a sudden, some of these people he had worked with through the MIT Media Lab were being hired up by these new software development companies, and they didn't have to share their changes back, or they weren't sharing their changes back like they had been before. And this trend started to go towards this way of not sharing software and keeping it to ourselves, and not that spirit of collaboration was going away from that 1970s angle that we had then. So this bothered Richard Stallman at the time. And what do you do if you're Richard Stallman in 1983? He decides to define his values and try to create a free and open source operating system. So what he did in 1983 was drafted a set of, well, he launched the GNU project, but most notably with it, it came with a set of values, of core beliefs that he and the community that formed up around it believed were essential for all software. So you skip ahead 2 years later, you get to the Free Software Foundation. This is the legal entity that then emerges to support the development of the GNU project and this free and open source operating system. It was the first significant institution to protect and embrace free software. It also advocated for many parts of the free culture movement outside of written code only. In fact, 4 years later, under the Free Software Foundation and the GNU project in 1989, we would have L in 1989. So this was again drafted by the Free Software Foundation. And while technically not the very first license, it is the first of its kind. It introduces this radical concept at the time that we now call copyleft. And it marked a significant shift in perspective on the way that software is developed and how we distribute and share it with other people. We'll come back to that piece on copyleft a little bit later on. But important for this historical timeline, in 1991, a Finnish researcher sends out a mailing listserv post about this small project he's building in 1991 that we now know today is the Linux kernel and is one of the largest public internet infrastructure projects as we know it today. It's also one of the earliest open source projects and was an early adopter of the GPL version 2 that was released earlier that year. And as we know it, Linux kernel development practices shaped an entire decade of the free culture movement inside of the technology world. mostly in part through its adoption of this radical copyleft open source license. So, but still, even with Linux, in 1991, open source and free software, it's still a niche and it's really in a bubble. So, but in 1997, things start to get a little more attention and open source starts to go mainstream. So this international breakthrough is often charted with the release of this 1997 book called The Cathedral and the Bazaar, which was it was the first approach to describe these two significantly different models of software development, where this Cathedral is this closed source proprietary software development, and the Bazaar is more of this open market, free culture kind of way of developing software. The only problem is that the business world thinks that the word free, especially in 1997, is a really scary word. So people heard free software and they were like, oh, like, we don't want to give away our works, but there was more to it. So that's why at the end of our timeline here, we get to 1998, which is where the open source initiative was founded, in a way to act as a liaison between this free culture movement, deeply rooted in the values and philosophy that it was started with, and then the business world, more of this like market approach to how this intellectual property work exists. So the open source initiative's whole mission at the time was to convince the world that free does not mean you're giving away your bottom line. And this is where we see the first uses of the term open source software emerge. And to this day, the open source initiative, since 1998, has maintained a legal definition of what open source means. And they actually have these 10 different components of what makes an open source license an open source license. And that is what history and a lot of things from 20 years ago. And why does this history matter? This was all in the 20th century. Well, it matters today because we're still having some of the same conversations in the 2020s that we were having in the 1980s and the 1990s. And this is a good bridge to talk about one of the essential basics, or the most fundamental part of how you have to understand free and open source software, or really anything that's free and open source. When we say that, we always are talking about 4 freedoms. And these are 4 essential principles. They're the rules of open source, and these cannot be changed. If you change any one of these freedoms, suddenly what you're doing is it becomes a proprietary work. You go against this historical ethos of how open source has been built over these last 40 years. But let's talk through these a little bit. So there's these 4 freedoms that I like to remember in this 4 R's way of remembering it. There's the freedom to read, that you have the ability to see how something works and study the source. On how you can use the software. You can run it and use it any way you see fit. You can revise it. You can make changes. You're always allowed to make changes to an open source work. And finally, redistribute. You're always permitted to redistribute your changes with other people. So if that's like the fundamental core that hasn't changed in all these 40 years, how has open source changed? How has it changed? So I like to give this great example. Looking back at 2001 and Microsoft, there was Jim Alchin, who was one of the top vice presidents in Microsoft's engineering team at the time. And he's quoted in this article or white paper, open source is an intellectual property destroyer. I can't imagine something that could be worse than this for the software business and the intellectual property business. Well, okay, that's some pretty fire words there, but we skip ahead 14 years and whoa, Microsoft officially in love with open source. Microsoft has been working with open source for a while, over 10 years already. The company declared their love for Linux. They have 140 working groups dealing with open standards and over 400 projects where code is written before being given back to the community. And that's just 2015. So, I mean, we look ahead now, and Microsoft went even deeper in 2018 when they dropped $7.5 billion on GitHub, acquiring that in their portfolio stack, being the place where the world really develops so much of our open source infrastructure and software. Skip ahead another year, we go outside of the Microsoft lens, and whoa, IBM buys open source company Red Hat for $34 billion, the largest tech acquisition, I think, to date since that time. But $34 billion, just think about that for a moment. So when we get to this point today, open source has won, but we're at this position now where many people are starting to say, well, ask, now what? So open source, it's no longer this controversial add-on to collaborative work. And often it's what's expected. So today's attitude towards open source is changing. The connections between open source, innovation, and transparency are becoming more clear. And many more organizations, governments, and other stakeholders are considering open source seriously. So today, the open source movement, as we know it, is kind of like the dog that was chasing the car and caught the car. So the taste of victory is maybe not quite what the free software movement envisioned from the 1980s. You know, if you look around us, the whole world isn't open source. There's still so much technology and things built around us that are proprietary or closed source. There's no digital utopia or anything like that open source has brought. So with that said, it's not all bad either. It's just important to take this into account for the present moment. And this is one thing that will shape our perspective for how far we've come already and how far there's still to go even now. So this is the abridged timeline. We just went through 40 years of history. Wow, thanks for bearing through that. Hope that wasn't too put you to sleep or too much boring history. Well, now we'll take this into more of an applied lens, and we'll actually look at what does building your open source house look like for your own projects and your own communities. And we'll divide that into 4 pieces here, 4 phases: foundations, structures, entry points, and interior decorating. So before we get into this building the house, I like to start with the thing that helped start it all for us, at least in the Office of Innovation, looking back at these digital innovation principles, which were first drafted, I think, in 2009, and they've been updated since, but I like to hone in on this 6th part of the digital innovation principles, which is use open standards, open data, open source, and open innovation. I won't read all this text here, but just that last paragraph has one that's really important to me and what I look at with how we build our work. But to develop software to be open source by default with the code made available in public repositories and supported through developer communities. And today, supporting developer communities is the reason we're here. So coming back to this metaphor of a house, why a house? So a house is this metaphor that we can use for discussion purposes of how we build a project community where people can gather, collaborate, and share things together. So what goes into building this open source house? I mentioned those 4 phases. We'll go into each of them, with foundations being more about the strategy and legal, policy, and governance. Structures, we start getting into moving that strategy into concrete tactics, beginning this construction of the project. Then entry points, being how we enable collaboration with clear onboarding pathways. And finally, this interior decorating stage where you get to make things all your own. So let's go into this. We'll start with foundations. What goes into the foundations of an open source project? It's important that when you begin your journey on creating your open source house, that you have strong foundations from the beginning. And you know, this is a very gray picture. It's a concrete slab. The foundational stuff, it can often be boring. It can often be long. It's often things that aren't always obvious. Yet, even with that in mind, having those strong foundations are the backbone of your strategy and your open source approach. So early stage decisions like licensing, contribution guidelines, and community processes All these things impact your ability to build and sustain successful open source works. So maybe at times it's boring, but it is really essential. In the UNICEF open source mentorship program that you'll be all a part of, we like to try and make this a more fun and energetic and engaging topic than through the mentorship program, but we'll explain more on that in tomorrow's session. So what do some of the earliest foundations of an open source project look like? Licenses are a common one. These are the rules of play, how you create a structure and framework around your intellectual property that enable others to participate, the legal backbone. Copyright with intellectual property, clearly documenting the ownership of your copyright and being able to understand how open source licenses impact your copyrighted works. Trademarks are another one, building your brand around the open source intellectual property and how and why doing this is an important step for the long-term sustainability. And lastly, pieces on community governance, getting into the parts of how people actually interact and collaborate with your project and work together. Examples of this will be a project vision and mission statement, a community statement and commitment and goals, decision-making structures, codes of conduct. All of these things go into the beginning stage. So next, once we have those foundations in place over that first quarter, we start to look a little bit more at the structures that exist around the project. And this is when we start to go from these abstract conversations and really strategical lens into the details. So once you better understand your own course of action and the things you're hoping to get out of open source and contribute back to open source, then you can take your first real steps to building your open source house. So in this phase, the focus is often internal and it's on your own teams and processes so that later on, in order that you can provide a facility where people can work together and collaborate, you have these essential structures already in place, no problem. So putting these structures in place and practicing them with your internal teams and processes puts you on the road to collaboration. What do the structures of an open source project look like? That can be things like public processes with public bug tracking and feature planning, having your project management work happening in open view. It's in documentation, explaining how to make contributions back to the project repository and creating documentation for developers and contributors, and quality assurance, exploring test coverage and other tools that can help enable good hygiene for tech projects like continuous integration or continuous deployment. So this is into the structures piece. Once you have the structure of your house, you can start to think a little bit more about how you bring people in, these entry points. So you can think of it, once you have these collaborations structures in place, they need to be primed. Looking at opening processes into your structures rather, and helps you think about how you build up from that previous phase to better interface with the public. So in this phase, you start to think a lot more about how other human beings outside your immediate team can actually get involved. And while your internal company meetings are not meant for the public, your open source planning should be designed to be happening in the public. So it's important to do this step because you have to create the doors for people to find their way in. It's important if you want to leverage this promised potential of what open source can bring to your business model. So what are some entry points of open source projects? Some of these can be fast feedback loops. So having like a continuous integration, continuous deployment pipeline in place. Having contributors and having internal and external validation on changes. So if people always know that their contributions haven't broken anything. Using templates to create to enable different kinds of contributions, such as issue reporting, bug reports, feature requests, change requests, or triage support. Good first issues are another one. Bite-sized tasks that invite key stakeholders or the general public to participate and get involved. And lastly, outreach, starting that question of how you actually interface with a public community and how you do some of that networking in the wider open source ecosystem. And once you have all your entry points set up and ready to go, you'll finally get to this last page or this last stage of interior decorating. So a little more abstract perhaps than the other ones, but also equally important. So a house does not automatically become a home. A house is a three-dimensional space with rooms, walls, windows, a roof, and some doors. But a home is lived in by people, and it reflects those people who are living in it. So having a livable place for your fellow collaborators to keep folks, or having that space be livable is important, so you can keep folks interested and engaged with the project. So in this fourth and final stage, which really is never ending, just like interior decorating can be, you begin to tailor your open source product, your community, and the networks that you're participating in as they align to your vision, the mission, and your community goals. So what does interior decorating look like in these early stage projects? It can be looking back and checking back in on your strategy that you were building out in the first phase, making sure that documenting what things have changed and what things are still the same. Identifying key metrics of success and areas that you can measure over time to make sure you're still on track to meeting those goals. And finally, making a new map of wherever all this feedback is guiding you and telling you to go next, figuring out and being confident in your approach that where you go is the right direction for your project. So I mentioned, a livable house, that's important, right? Well, to add some other perspective on why having using this house metaphor again, why having it livable is so important. Let's just look around at the ecosystem for a little bit. So last year, GitHub releases some data as part of their end of year reports. Just last year, as of September 2020, 56 million people, 56 million developers on GitHub. So many more people are getting involved with open source every year. And on average, more people are participating on GitHub in their first 90 days after registering than they were in the previous year. So there's a lot of developers out there. And this is even just looking at one site, not looking at other tools and platforms like GitLab or Bitbucket and all the other ones out there. Well, if we keep going on this comparison, how many repositories did we have on GitHub just last year? That's another 60 million just in 2020 that were created. So there's no shortage of projects to choose from out there. What there is a shortage of is humanitarian projects that have infrastructure for supporting their communities around their projects. So to put this metric in another way, for every one developer on GitHub, there is 1.07 projects for each developer, assuming every registered developer participates. So standing out and attracting new contributors to a project, it's a competitive space. If you want to have more than just that one person out of the pool. But one of the newer metrics that they released in this last year I thought was interesting is that 72% of the Fortune 50 companies are also using GitHub Enterprise. So this can be a really interesting place for you to actually network, learn from other people, and leverage innovations that are enabled in part by open source. So standing out for you, or standing out in this new to you open source network, can lead to unexpected teamwork and collaboration as well. Okay, so now we've gotten through building the open source house. I hope you'll be ready and enthusiastic to go under this journey with me for the next year, which we'll talk about more of the logistics and details of what that will be like in tomorrow's call. But now I want to switch over to the final part of this presentation, looking at sustainable business models for open source. And in this part of the presentation, we're going to do a quick overview on some of these things, but we'll look at how licenses play a part, look at some threats and benefits of open source, and what some common approaches are in the market today. So again, we'll revisit this licensing piece, comes up a lot in open source. There are two main licensing strategies for software, hardware, content, and data. And these are known as permissive and copyleft. the kind of license you choose has a huge part of the direction you can go with your open source work and what strings or what rules come attached to the work. Now, remember, we can't go against any of those 4 freedom pieces, but where things start to get interesting is while there are some open source licenses that, while they do guarantee those 4 freedoms, then they say, well, if you want to change the license and make closed source improvements, I guess you can do that too. Whereas some of these copyleft licenses still have the same 4 freedoms, except they also say, oh, and if you make changes, you have to use the same license. You can't, and you have to follow the exact same rules that are stated there. So kind of this way of saying you always have to follow the 4 freedoms. So during the open source mentorship program with UNICEF, you'll get some guidance on how these 2 licensing strategies differ and what their pros and cons are as they relate to what you're building in specific. So let's look also at some of the threats and benefits of open source. Well, if we look at the threats, what are the things that could be risks, unmitigated risks? Well, someone can take your stuff, they can find it, they can make changes to it, all those things in those 4 freedoms. They can do any of those things. Well, that could be a threat if you're not ready for that. Someone can also come along and make it better or cheaper. Someone could take your same work and go after a different market. Those are all some of the threats, but where you see some of the benefits, well, someone can take your stuff. Again, so a rising tide lifts all boats. A great example of this was a few years ago when Elon Musk released Tesla's battery patents as open source. So this way, the entire automobile industry could do better around battery technology. Some other benefits is that it also enables you to be agile with innovation. It's easier for you to be disruptive by responding quickly to changing requirements as they happen. And finally, you get to put in less time, less effort, and less resources spent on patents, litigation, and building custom software and hardware components. So these are some of the things that you get to leverage when you're doing open source right. To give an example here, I always like to point to, from the hardware side, the Arduino boards. These are little breadboard computer boards that can be programmed to do all kinds of different things with lights or all kinds of like different microcontroller use cases. But the hardware, the entire spec for the Arduino board is completely open source. You can actually find the parts to build and assemble one of these things through a common standard. They're all built the same way and the standard is documented. And they built an entire business model around being able to offer these free and open source available boards, but still have a sustainable business model around it in a couple of different ways. And this is a nice transition for us to talk a little bit more about some of these specific approaches in the business model. So before we can look at the different approaches, you have to answer this first fundamental question. Do you want to charge for the base product? So this is a question that varies a lot, but you might be familiar with the concept of a loss leader. And in like the retail industry, folks have been giving things away there since there were stores. You can also look at mobile video games where most are free. Some make millions or even billions of dollars. So there are ways for you to build a base model where you either are charging for a base product or you are not. But your decision at this stage will have a huge impact on what options and which pathways are open to you going forward. So in the event that you decide to give the base product away for free, we'll quickly look here at 7 different approaches. And for some of these, give an example of how it looks like in the market today, as we've seen. So we'll start first looking at enterprise or targeted versions. This is a pretty common approach. Sometimes it's called open core or an enterprise version. So being able to distinguish, a targeted version for an open source version and then one that has these extra enterprise features on it, where the enterprise one has different features, or it's better optimized, or it's more flexible and can be extended. Red Hat Enterprise Linux is a great example of this in the market. Having services around your product is another way. And this often can look like consulting and customer support, customization, and tailoring a solution for a specific customer's use cases, and other ways of bringing the most value of your customer's use around your product. And you see this a lot in how Red Hat does their support arm of their business, how they started as a business in 2000 and, well, I guess 1998, 2001, I can't remember. But that is how they really started their business model from the very beginning, was through their support and being able to offer the best in class engineering talent and support for their product. You can also have where services are your product and you are selling services with an open source product as your service delivery method. You see this a lot in the cloud vendor space, where Red Hat OpenShift is another good example of this and how they build that platform and also provide hosting and services for it as well. You can also have things like content. If you're building out a huge amount of content, having things like chapters or levels that are a different way for you to distinguish tiers of content. You can also have packaging with different compiled versions, or bundling different pieces of software together, or integrating them across different stacks. You can also have training where you actually use the tech, support people around using the technology itself, and even offering certifications around the tech. Again, Red Hat has a really excellent example of this through their learning subscription program and their certification courses that they offer for all their different products. So looking at some of these 7 examples, are there things that you could be doing? Some questions that are helpful to think through at this stage as you're building out these open source strategies is, do those of you primarily selling a service want to add things like training or certifications to your packages? Do you want to stratify your product offerings for different levels of users? Or do you want to resell or have a referral service for some of the things that you're doing? So these are all questions around the open source sustainability piece. And fortunately, you will have a chance to work with the UNICEF Office of Innovation and get coaching on some of these things over your contract periods. So tomorrow in our session that we're running with the fund, we'll go into details on what the open source mentorship program is and what you can expect out of it. So that'll be tomorrow's session, and we'll get into more of the concrete details of what your next steps will be and how things will work when you're working with UNICEF for the next few months. And with that, that brings us to the end of the slide deck, and we can get into some Q&A here. So before we switch back over from Q&A, you can find all these slides online as well if you want to save a copy of these. You'll also see a lot more of this resource shared in the coming weeks around the open source inventory. That's a link that is a knowledge base of open source best practices and advice for working and leading open. And you can also find some other useful things here, like a quick article post on organizing your project's workflow on GitHub. Or UNICEF has an open source business models course that you can take for free through our Agora platform.